Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Williams. I'm the Senior Vice President of Hospitality for the LA and Orange County Audio Society. I have been given the honor of producing room tuning tips by Anthony Grimani. Anthony Grimani is a veteran of Dolby Labs and Lucasfilm T.H.E, playing a major role in developing many of the standards for home theater over the last 30 years. He founded PMI Engineering in 1999 and MSR Acoustics in 2003, where he's assembled an experienced team in the fields of acoustics, physics, and architecture, mechanical engineering, and construction. PMI's design work has won many awards and is featured in Home Theater Magazine, Residential Systems, and others. PMI conducts training workshops and seminars worldwide about home theater acoustics and calibration. Anthony has calibrated more than 450 listening rooms in theaters worldwide and is widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts on room acoustics. Anthony has just notified me that he has developed a new line of high-end audio products, which he will share with us if we have time. Anthony's seminar will consist of a 1-hour lecture followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Please hold your questions until after the lecture. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Anthony Grimani.
Thank you, John. How is everybody going? Good. First of all, I have to deal with a little technical problem that is apparently that, let's see here. Interesting. The projector was disconnected, and then now my computer says, I don't have a presentation to do, it's time to go to the pool, forget about it, it's lunchtime, I'm not doing it. Give me a quick second here, we'll get this going. Okay, so I may start with a little bit of Q&A asking you guys, who is here and what do you want to hear about? So this will actually help me figure out which presentation I'm going to pull up. So first of all, how many audio files in the room? Okay, how many multi-channel audio files in the room? Okay, a few. How many home theater files? I just invented that word. Great, so a few of those. That's good. There's a good spread of interests. Anybody actually already have a question about room tuning? Somebody that may go, you know, I've been wondering about this thing, battling this other thing, I don't know what to do, how do I work through this? Okay, so John, do you have that microphone? Right there. There you are. Look at that. See, in all of that yakety-yakking, this works again. Okay, so what's your name?
My name's Paul.
Paul has a question.
So I'm trying to get this for real life, where you have a room that maybe isn't perfect, and you have furniture that can only be put in certain places, and so on and so forth. Because we go to these rooms, and there's $50,000 worth of speakers and $150,000 worth of gear, and then you get home, and you have your system in the constraints of your real life.
Right.
So how do you get around all that to still make the most of what you have in your less than perfect environment?
Okay, so the question from Paul, right?
Yeah.
Paul says, how do you make, $150,000 worth of gear sound right in your less than perfect environment?
Well, suppose you don't have $150,000 worth of gear.
Okay, suppose you got $200,000 a gear. And so here's the nasty little secret. It doesn't matter how expensive the gear is, the room is going to screw it up. And there is no way that a $50,000 speaker is less affected by a room than a $300 speaker, to an extent, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There are ways to design speakers to make them a little less room dependent, but by and large, a room's going to completely swamp everything you want to hear, and you have to kind of take control of it. So that's reality number one, and I'm going to give you as many tips as I can about how to control that, number one. Number two, there are no perfect rooms. There is ultimately I shouldn't say, no, there are no perfect rooms. There is always going to be compromises and constraints. That's how engineering is. Engineering is about knowing how to best combine all the constraints you're working with, whether they're money, time, aesthetics, color, and make the best of it. Now, the reason there's a good reason to do this presentation is I found over 30 years of screwing around with this stuff that there's often simple little things you can do to get rid of the big burrs, the big problems, right? So you may not be sculpting the David, okay? It's a beautiful piece of sculpture. It took a long time to make. You may not be getting there, but you can go from a chunk of stone that's roughly hewn into something that looks like a reasonable sculpture without necessarily spending a ton of money. And I'm amazed how often I go to people's places who've spent $250,000 or to demo rooms here or to showrooms in stores and just see these big chunks of errors and go, you know, if you only did this, you'd suddenly improve the sound a lot. So maybe this presentation should be entitled, How to Get Rid of the Big Problems, so that you can then start worrying about the small problems. So, great. So thanks for that question. So we've talked about this, all the different things I've done. So I spent a fair amount of time in the kind of the research and engineering side of audio, and have noticed, because I'm lucky enough to get paid. I'm lucky enough to get paid to play with sound. Holy moly. It's a nice thing. And I've noticed some things that make huge differences, and other things that you go, what's everybody so excited about this? There's really nothing audible to me or to a panel of 50 listeners on this. So I'm going to talk about what seems to make more difference to more people more of the time. So I am a musician. So I grew up in a musical family, and I've always listened to music, so I have a sense for what music should sound like. I've recorded albums, I've been with musicians. At some point in my life, I had to choose whether to be a professional musician or an engineer. I chose, I think wisely, I don't know, we'll see. The choice was partially based on looking at what a 45-year-old guy in the band looked like and felt like, and I was like, at 20, I decided I don't want to look like that guy when I'm 45. So that was part of the decision. Okay, let's move on. So we've talked about who you are. Here's an outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about overall elements of quality sound. You know, what does it mean when we say the sound is good? And I'm going to just give some vernacular on that. We're going to talk about electronics, speakers, and rooms. We're going to talk a little bit about program material, and warning, this will get technical. I'm going to get into some stuff that is going to show some charts and engineering issues, and you don't necessarily have to understand it all. My main interest is to get you exposed to the fact that here's things that you should be thinking about. All right, so our goal ultimately is to achieve accurate sound at the listening position or the listening positions, and there's a lot of different ways to think of that. My philosophy is that if you get rid of all the errors that are in the way between the source material and your ear, you have accurate sound. Along the way, from musicians, from the bow of a violin to the microphone, through all the electronics, through the recording devices, through the media that gets the sound over to you, through the electronics and speakers, there's possible accumulation of errors, and those errors create non-accurate sound. And what I want to talk about over here is a concept for how to get rid of those errors so that you get back closer to what was intended to be heard. And there is an intention. What is supposed to be heard? So I spent a fair amount of time behind a console working with musicians and producers and engineers and going, here's a bunch of people who are spending months and months and months crafting an audio sculpture with very finite elements in it of level and timbre and dynamics. It's not a random haphazard effect. It is as carefully crafted as a very, very fine dish. Any of you guys like food here? Okay, so yesterday I asked this question and nobody raised their hand. I love to connect the dots between the emotional experience of listening to good sound to the emotional experience of eating good food, right? And preferably you eat good food while listening to good sound and drinking good wine, all at the same time. What else do we have to do in life, right? There's a few other pursuits, but that's basically it. So, I actually had a really nice dinner at a place yesterday, and it was like, man, the person who crafted these foods really thought about it, about the blend of this element and that element and that element, and how it's presented on the plate, and how the person who brings it to you is pleasant. That whole delivery makes the experience of eating food, you're like, man, I just want to keep doing this all day long. And somehow I remain skinny. I have no idea. It must be agonizing over sound that keeps the skinniness going. So, music that you're hearing has been obsessed over the same way as a really, really fine dish. And what you need to do is to make sure that the delivery of that is correct, that you don't take that plate and, drop it on the way up the stairs and throw it all back on the plate and go, well, it's all the same food, here it is. No, you got to present it the right way. But let me tell you, there's a lot of obsession that goes on in the production of the program material, whether it's music for films, sound for films, doesn't really matter. People obsess over it. And they get to a point of knowing so well what they're listening to that if you were to change the volume on the console, the monitoring level, by half a decibel, you just tell them, okay, shut your eyes, I'm going to change something. You change the level by half a dB, which is known as I'll use slang language, as a gnat's ass, really small. They'll go, okay, something changed. They may not know that it was a half a dB louder, but they're so familiar with the material that even half a decibel of loudness makes them go, it's different. I can't quite tell you what. So that's the level of precision they're working at. And I often refer back to that level because if you can actually bring a producer to your house and play her piece of program material and go, is this what you intended for this group to sound like? And they go, yes, you've got it. You've reached accuracy, right? And in the levels of accuracy, I like to break things into kind of 4 groups, and I'm going to be coming back and talking about this a lot. So first of all is the frequency balance, the balance between bass, middle, mids, and treble, and everywhere in between, actually broken into very small chunks of either thirds of an octave or sixths of an octave, if you can get that precise. So if I was to, you guys know that there's 10 octaves in most of the stuff we're listening to. You could break that into 3, 3, 3, or you can go smaller and smaller and smaller and go, I want to cross that whole range. I want everything to be restituted to my ear and brain equally balanced. Really important, number 1. Number 2 is the overall dynamics, as in the difference between the loudest peak you're going to listen to and the quietest sound you can hear. And you really need to have a room that's got at least 100 decibels of range from the noise floor to the loudest sound you can hear, and the loudest sound is based on the ability of your speakers to play loud and the power amplifier to drive them. Oh, and of your neighbors to not be bothered by it. The next thing is I'm just going to call it sound stage overall, which is the ability to hear where sounds are placed from extreme left to extreme right and from front to back. And a properly running 2-channel system can actually resolve a sense of holographic 3-dimensional sound space if everything is right. If everything is right. Now, to me, one of the big differences between 2-channel and multi-channel audio is the ability to reproduce that 3-dimensional holographic sound space with less hassle and a broader sweet spot. So when I said holographic space, a few people nodded up and down. Those same people that nodded up and down, you know that if you move 1 seat to the right, what happens to the hologram? It falls apart. It's gone. And it's gone because the relationship between the 2 speakers that forms that hologram is gone. Well, once you wrap yourself with 5 speakers that are creating the hologram, not so much relying on combinations of images, but on actual sounds coming from speakers, you can move around and maintain the hologram. And when you go to 7 speakers, even more so. And now with what people at Dolby and T.H.E are doing, which is to give us up to 32 speakers, you can create a fantastic hologram that you can sit anywhere you want in this whole space and produce a very realistic sense of audio. So, element 3 is the soundstage. Element 4 is sort of related to the soundstage, but I like to separate it out, which is a sense of envelopment. Aside from hearing where sounds are placed, can you also, at sometimes in the music, have a sense that, hey, I'm just bathing in a sound field? If you go to a good concert hall, there's some sound coming from the stage, and then there's this energy, there's this musical energy that's the result of reverberation that's enveloping you in the space. It makes you feel good. right? There's a sense of like, I'm here. The crescendo at the end, and then it resonates in the space for a while. It just feels like this is enjoyable. And it's really hard for a pair of speakers to create that enveloping sound space unless you have properly recorded material, properly transmitted, and properly played back. And when that's all there, it's glorious, right? Couple that with a nice glass of red wine or Louis XIII cognac, and life is great, right? Cigar? Did you say cigar? Sublime. There's people who also like to do the cigars in that. I don't inhale, but whatever. So let's talk about errors. In the electronics, there's actually these days relatively few errors anymore. Years ago, it was hard to make a piece of electronics that worked very well, but today, at a reasonable price, you can convey signal quite well. There's still one thing out there that's called the impedance, the relative impedance between the source and the received device. That's an issue. I'm going to talk about that. In the speaker errors, there are more problems. Some speakers have response issues, radiation pattern issues, distortions. Certainly the placement of the speaker in the room is going to have an enormous effect on what you're hearing, and the errors, and the overall voicing of the speaker, which is the sense of balance between bass, mid, and treble, is variable from room to room and from speaker to speaker. It takes a lot more to control all of that. And lastly, room errors. So assuming you are bringing speakers into a room and that that room is wrapping walls and floor and ceiling around those speakers, that enclosure, that cavity is going to change the sound of the speaker as much as doing this, right? Suddenly I'm very large, I'm the Hulk, and now I'm just me. And this is a room. This is what a room is doing to your speakers. It's changing it. So standing waves, which I'll explain, there's resonances in the room, there's reflections, there's noise, there's all kinds of things that create issues in these rooms, and we're going to talk about that. Sir, you're taking a picture. If you want a PDF of this so you can relax, I can send you one at the end. Or just give me, grab one of my cards over here, give me one of your cards, and I'll send you a PDF. And if you want to take pictures, that's fine too. All right, so program material, this is sort of interesting, can also have errors. I mean, I've witnessed recording sessions where the sound system in the recording session was improperly set up, and so the perception of what was heard from the sound coming out of the speakers was not right. And so you end up with a track that, if it was listened over another system that would be considered reference, it would sound bad. So, for example, if by mistake somebody had too much bass in the sound system in the mix studio, what would happen to the track? This is a quiz, pop quiz. Too much bass out of the speakers in the studio, what would the sound recording or the mix down sound like? Not enough bass. It'll be shy. So when you listen to a number of pieces of program material quickly in quick sequence, you'll notice that the voicing changes a fair amount from one track to the other, right? And, our industry figured this out a long time ago, which is why they gave us this control called bass and the other one called treble. And there's really two reasons why those change a lot from track to track, and some of it could be the monitoring environment, which is remarkably different from studio to studio. The other one could be taste. There's some people who love more bass and other people who like less bass. That's just how it is. And same thing with high frequencies. And I've been in sessions where it's like, no man, that's way too much bass. And it's like, what are you talking about? We need more low end. And it's like, there is no right, no wrong. Well, there is a right. You put an orchestra on the stage, and you tell the people over there that are behind just the curtain to be quiet, and there is going to be a sound to the balance between the low frequency, mid frequency, and high frequency instruments, and as much as possible, you want to try to get back there within reason, right? That would be accuracy. So, now let's talk about the range of error effects. I call this the triangle of errors. Electronic speakers and room acoustics, I like to correlate the error effects this way. Electronics really today produce small errors. And you can obsess over them, but obsessing over those without worrying about speakers means that you're not worried about bigger problems. And of course, worrying about speakers before worrying about room acoustics means you're missing the point. So as you go through my presentation, we're going to talk in bigger and bigger and bigger effects. And one effect will actually be 30 decibels big, which if those of you who know what a decibel is, you're going to go, nah, you're kidding. It's like, no, it can be what a room can do. So, people obsess a lot about interfaces, cables, power cords, interface cables between preamps and amplifiers, and you want a decent connector, but realize that today the electronics packages we have, which I'm going to just put into 4 blocks: source devices, preamps, decoders, processors, maybe equalizers, which I'll talk about later, and power amps. These products are all very good, and the wires between them at a reasonable price are very good, as long as you respect basic rules of output impedance to input impedance. Things work pretty well. I would generally say that by and large the electronics interface is well under control today, and if you've got an issue with a tuning in your room and you're not liking the sound, don't be worrying about this first. Worry about this last. Now, realize that you're going to take a signal that's generally under control, connect it to a speaker, and then you're going to let it spray sound into a room where some of the sound comes to you and a lot of it bounces around the room. That's generally out of control. And so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about the acoustic interface, which is what happens from the speaker to your brain through this environment, which is the electroacoustic environment. Okay? This is the one that causes the biggest issues. So, on the electronics, most of it's very good today. Maybe you can talk about jitter, maybe you can talk about noise. There's some things that you can point to, and people who are really passionate about those will give you great reasons why worry about those. I would say one of the biggest things that you do need to consider is the input and output impedances of products. So in electronics, impedance refers to how rock solid something is or how prone it is to be jiggled around by other influences. And so how many of you were in the presentation yesterday, by the way? So there's 2 repeat offenders. Thanks for coming back. I mentioned yesterday, and I'll use this again, that you could think of impedance as 2 people pushing each other. Me, who I'm a small, shrimpy guy, I weigh 130 pounds, 5'5", and then my recently departed office assistant, who's 5'8" and weighs 300 pounds. Okay? It's a male-female push-pull. Well, guess what? If I try to push her, I'm only going to get so far. If she tries to push me, where do I go? That away. And she pushed me around a lot. So she has, strangely enough, she has a low impedance, and I have a high impedance relative to each other. And I know it's a little confusing because you would think, heavier, smaller, low, high. Well, the sense of impedance is relative to ground, relative to like the solid bedrock under her. She has a low impedance. Her connection to ground is lowly impeded, and mine, because I only have 130 pounds worth of gravity connection, I have a higher impedance. So she can push me, and it's a lot harder for me to push her. You guys follow that? What does this have to do with audio? Give me a second. When the source device, I'm going to go back over here. This device needs to push signal into this device. So this has to have a lower impedance than this. This device has to push signal over here. This one has to have a lower impedance than that, and so on and so forth. The power amplifier needs to have a low impedance relative to the speaker, so it can push electrons that way when the cones have to go out, and pull electrons this way without the speaker going, I'm not moving. And how many of you guys have tube amps or like the idea of tube amps? So there's a third of the room has tube amplifiers. They look fantastic, they have good sound, all of this stuff. But the interesting thing about a tube amp is there's conditions where it could be a 300-pound person pushing a 300-pound person. And in that push and pull, the fight can be much more interesting than the one between me and Susan. Our fight will last 10 seconds or less. But, 2 sumo wrestlers going at it at the same weight, if you're into that kind of thing, can be interesting. So, let's take a look at what really happens. You had a question.
So when you say source, are you talking about the CD?
Okay, good question. So when I say source, what do I mean? Two devices talking to each other. The one that's feeding signal to the next one I'm going to call the source, and the other one is receive. And yes, there is a source device that's talking to a preamp. Then the preamp turns around and it becomes the source for the amplifier. The amplifier goes, thank you very much. I will add volts and current to this, and I'm going to drive speaker cones, domes, things like that, right? Each one of those really has to be weak, essentially, in a way, it has to be weaker than the one before and has to be stronger than the one after, right, to be able to drive the next one. So this is a real measurement of a real speaker in a real condition. And what's here, this is where it gets technically interesting. This is warning, this is getting engineering. So this is a measurement of the impedance curve of a speaker, which means the resistance across frequency of a speaker. A speaker may be defined as an 8-ohm speaker or 4-ohm speaker, but you know that a speaker is not made out of a resistor. It's made out of a combination of coils with a crossover in front of it that has capacitors, resistors, more coils, and all the stuff in it. And that complex combination of devices means that if you actually measured the resistance at different frequencies, you'd find it goes up and down. And this is a real case scenario. If I remember well, this was a Snell speaker from several years ago when Snell was still around. You guys remember Snell? Yep. So what it shows here is that at the lower frequencies, the resistance of the speaker impedance was about 4 ohms, and then it went up to about almost close to 10 ohms at 80 hertz, then went back down to about 4 ohms, and then up to about 28 ohms, and then back down and up and down. And this is pretty typical for a speaker. And this one is actually well controlled compared to some. I've seen speakers that go down to 1 ohm at their low points and climb up to 35 ohms, which means that they go up and down and up and down. And that would be like a person who one day weighs 300 pounds and the next day weighs 50 pounds. I don't know how you do that. But one day they're going to win the battle, one day they're going to lose the battle.
That sound.
Okay. So the question is, how would that sound when it's doing that? Well, it depends. If the device that's driving that has a feeding resistance that's all the way down here, way down here, it won't have any sound at all. Because no matter what's going on in the variance of essentially weight of that speaker electronically, the amplifier goes, I don't care, I'm going to push you and shove you all I want. So that's Susan with her 300 pounds pushing my daughter at 50 pounds. There is going to be no control of one over the other. Boom, she's going to push her. Now, once Susan, the 300-pound office assistant, is confronted with a 200-pound or 250-pound or 300-pound person, now things get a little trickier. So a tube amplifier has an impedance that actually is right here, typically, 2 ohm. Strangely enough, between 1 and 2 ohm. And when that thing is trying to push this thing that's very close, you have interactions. And this is what it sounds like. I'm glad you asked that question. I didn't plant her here. What's your name? Susanna. Susanna asked the exact question. It was like, how does that affect the sound? Well, what's interesting is what you would want if you're looking at a measurement of frequency and level of signal going into the speaker, you'd want that as you put in 1 volt into the speaker at any frequency, that what comes out is identical. And interestingly enough, this is what would happen if you had a perfect amplifier driving the speaker. It would be a flat line across all frequencies. And this is what actually would happen with the tube amp in the measurement. There's actually a loss of 3 dB over here, a loss of 1 dB over here, loss of 3 dB, 1 dB, 4 dB, and back up to 2. So before the speaker even converts the electrical signal into sound, the interrelationship between the speaker and the amp has already created variations across frequency. And so what that sounds like is you took an equalizer, you guys know what that is, thing with the little sliders, and you actually turned down the low frequency, pushed up the mid bass, turned down the upper bass, pushed up the mid range, and you actually changed the sound. So what that would sound like, in this case, it would be a little bass shy, it would be a bit resonant in the 80 hertz region, so sounds like some cellos would sound like they're popping out. Then the warmth of singing would disappear, and then the mid-range would be kind of shrill. It won't sound good. And the amplifier is a very good amp, the speaker is a very good amp, but the interrelationship between them is not good. You guys follow this? So why do they make tube amps? Why did in the olden days tube amps work? Anybody know that? In the beginning, in the olden days, speakers were 16 ohms. And when you have an amplifier that has a 2 ohm output impedance, and you drive a 16 ohm speaker that would be all the way over here, the difference between 2 and 16 is big enough that the amplifier can push and shove the speaker all at once. In the modern day, amplifiers are still 2 ohms for tube amplifiers, and they're trying to drive speakers that go between, at the extreme, and I've seen many speakers in this industry that go from 1 ohm to 30 ohms, that go up and down, and the sound ain't right. And it ain't right to this point where you can actually measure the response. This is a measurement at the speaker terminals. So you actually put an analyzer at the speaker terminals and look at what's going into the speaker. It's wrong. Then you take a microphone, you put it in front of the speaker, and you measure exactly the same thing. That's what you're listening to. So thank you, Susanna, for asking that. Bottom line is it's not accurate. Is there a burning question, or can you wait until later? You can wait if you can just note it down, and I'll same thing here. He's on fire. Yeah.
So this is fascinating. I guess the question is, though, you said not to worry too much about this.
This you do want to worry about. All of the other things in electronics, all the other things in electronics, I know, I looked at that slide, it's like I should flip those two words. All the other things you shouldn't worry too much about. The impedance you should definitely worry about. However, what was the biggest error I mentioned here? Anybody remember how many decibels I mentioned? Okay, I said that problems with rooms can be up to 30, very good memory. I guess you guys are really listening. You must have been drinking your coffee or tea or whatever. And the biggest error over here is 3 or 4 dB. Are we going to worry about 30 dB problems or 4 dB problems? Let's worry about the 30 dB problems that I'm going to talk about later, but don't lose track of this. Okay, so even though this is the most egregious issue you would find in the effects of electronics today, it's still a small problem compared to what I'm about to start talking about. Okay. Oh, and by the way, this does not have to do with power of the amplifier. Whether the amplifier is a 5-watt single-ended triode amplifier or a 200-watt pentode, it don't matter. If its output impedance is 2 ohms, it's going to have interactions with the speaker. And they will be audible if you know what to listen for. All right, let's get on to speakers. So speakers have more possibility of errors. And when you're trying to pick a good speaker, you want to make sure it's got a good frequency response, which means that it restitutes all of the sounds equally across the entire range. You also want to make sure that its off-axis response, how it sprays sound into the whole room, is smooth. And this is the thing that people don't pay attention to. They may look at the fact that what feeds towards you is good, but really what matters is that the entire room be lit up with good quality sound. You also want to make sure that the speaker doesn't have lobing where there's peaks or dips of sounds at different places. You want to make sure it has the right directivity for you, which means how it's actually focusing sound towards you or not is right. And what is right? I'm going to talk about that because there is a thing called right. So in the pro audio side, there's a lot of talk about directivity, and I'll get back to that. In the home side, there's not enough of it, and I'll show you a great example of that. You want to make sure the speaker has enough power handling to handle how much power you want to get loud, and you want to make sure the speaker has enough sensitivity, which is its efficiency, given 1 watt, is the right amount to get to what you're trying to get to. You want to make sure the speaker has enough bass headroom. This is the thing, it's remarkable how often I'm hearing systems that sound great everywhere, and the low end, when there's big crescendos, big loud, those poor woofers are flapping around, and if you know what to listen for, it just sounds horrible. The way you don't hear it a lot of times is that there's mid-frequency and high-frequency sound that's masking the distortion of the woofers, but if you can actually cut off all of that sound by filtering it all out and just listen to those things, they're just sounding like, and that's not right. So you may as well have a speaker that's reliable, so you don't have to send it back to the manufacturer all the time, and all of that means good sound. So let's get into this a little more. Frequency response. Frequency response is a technical term. Actually, it should be called amplitude versus frequency response. That's a short for it, and just means when you feed signals into the speaker at equal voltage but varying frequencies, what should come out of the speaker acoustically is always the same. So if I put 1 volt into the speaker and I put it in at 40 hertz, which is low bass, I put it in at 1 kilohertz, which is the mid-frequency, or I put it in at 10 kilohertz, what should come out of it, pushing air and pulling air in the room, should always be the same energy. Okay? Tenet number 1 of sound quality. There's people who out there that make me cringe that say, hey, it doesn't matter. That's not what sound is. It's like, no, this does matter. If the speaker is not restituting linearly what you're putting into it, all bets are off. Both in frequency, interestingly enough, also in time. Now, I still see a lot of erring there. I still see a lot of errors there, and I'm working with a client. They've just spent $15,000 on a speaker, and I'm there to calibrate the room, and the first thing I do is I put a microphone relatively close to the speaker to see what is the speaker doing without too much room involved in it. Or sometimes I'll just take the speaker outside and put it where there's no room around it and measure it, and I see responses that are up and down. I'm like, okay, this thing's either broken or the designer who designed it and built it is broken, but it's a bad start. And you'd be amazed how often I'm in front of really expensive speakers that don't work right there. So you want the speaker to be smooth response on axis. You also want it to be smooth off axis. I've said this already twice. I'm probably going to say it about 4 times to really hammer the point home. Why do we worry about the frequency response on axis and off axis? So this would be charts, measured charts of frequency response. Green would be the on-axis one, which is, again, if you had a measurement chamber, special microphone, special room that you can measure speakers, and you put in a sweep of frequencies, you would get a line that somewhere between 20 and 30 hertz would start to develop full signal, and after that it'd be all smooth. And if you looked off-axis of the speakers, you'd want it to be close enough to the on-axis sound with deviations of no more than about 4 or 5 dB. So, this is what I'm calling the axial response. This is a picture of a room equipped with a 7-channel speaker system, 3 across the front, 2 sides, 2 backs, which is sort of the current state of the art, slowly getting obsoleted by some of the immersive audio systems. And if you listen to or measured the direct sound from the speaker to the listener, you would want to get this. Right? And this, again, being the resulting acoustic pressure at different frequencies as you change frequencies. And you can get test equipment, you can get test discs for relatively cheap that allow you to do this. Okay, I'll talk a little bit later about what's available there. Now, not only would you want the on-axis response to be good, but the off-axis response needs to be good so that it is reasonably similar to the direct sound. A little bit of deviation off-axis is okay, but not too much. Okay, I've now said that, I think, 4 times. You'd be amazed how many speakers out there, when you actually measure the response at 20 or 30 degrees off axis, what you find is these peaks and valleys when the direct sound was reasonable. And there's a lot of different ways that results. The point here is not to do a lecture on speaker design. The point is you got to work with manufacturers who have worried about this, who've actually made sure they made a speaker that works well off axis. And why does that matter? You're not, the speaker's sending sound over there, you're not there to hear it. Why does it matter? Reflections. So let's reflect a little bit upon reflections. Thank you. I'm going to introduce the concept of sound power. In the field of acoustics, sound power does not refer to how loud a system is, but it refers to the net energy that a speaker is putting into an environment. And that's because the net power over time is energy. Power is the net total energy that would get into this room. And the sound power is a combination of a direct sound plus energy that would have missed your head and bounced around the room a little bit, either at 10 degrees off axis or 20 degrees off axis or 30 degrees off axis or 40 degrees off axis or 50 or 60, 70. We'll stop at 70. So from the right side of this room, or the right side of this speaker when you're looking at it, you got a direct sound accompanied by all these reflections that come back to you later. And you're hearing the green arrow, you're hearing the red arrow. And then if you look at the other side of the speaker, you get all this extra stuff. So what you're actually hearing is a condition in which reflections actually dominate. In a typical listening room, let's say you have a room that's, I don't know, 25 feet, 20 to 25 feet long, and you're sitting 12 to 14 feet away from the speaker. At your listening position, you hear more of the energy contributed by the red arrows than the one by the green arrow, because there's only one path here, and the other ones are a multiple set of paths. Yes, they're longer. Yes, there's more bounces around the room. Yes, it's delayed. But the net energy going into that hole here and that hole here, which then leads to a connection to your brain, is dominated by reflection. And if you don't control that, you end up with chaos. And there's two forms of things you have to control. One is, first of all, the energy that's going over to the rest of the room needs to be reasonably good quality and smooth, one. And then what the room is returning to you needs to be good, too. Once you control those two things, you will approach audio nirvana, and then your food will taste better, your wine will taste better, your life will be better, you will live to be 102. And if you believe that, I'd like to talk to you after the presentation about a bridge I have somewhere. So, we got to worry about this. So, what's all this about directivity? So this is the discussion in acoustics or electroacoustics is about the directivity of a speaker, and it really is one of the most important things. So understand, like I said, you hear more reflected sounds at the typical seating position than direct sounds. If you don't believe me, by the way, how many people believe me? Wow. I can go far with that. I have this investment I want to talk to you about. No, I actually wish this class was 5 hours long so I could prove everything I'm saying. I don't want to call anybody a charlatan, but wouldn't it be great if I said something and then I proved it to you where you can actually hear it and see it for yourself? That'd be great. If I had the time, I would actually have a pair of speakers over here, and I would play some music, and I would stand in front of this speaker, and the people sitting over there would hear no change in the sound from me being here or being here. And that's because with this room that's largely untreated, there's a lot of absorption on that side, but there's a fair amount of reflections around. You're so dominated by reflection that getting rid of that one direct path don't make no difference. And I encourage you, either in your own listening rooms or when you go around in the demos over here, to try that. Actually, especially in the bigger rooms, if you walk in and you see it's all hard surfaces, have somebody stand in front of the left speaker while you're sitting in the middle of the room listening to the sound stage and go, wow, it did not change. It's kind of spooky. But it makes sense. If you're blocking one very small portion of the net energy going to your ear, it's not going to change it, right? So, the presentation's only an hour and a half, so I can't do it. Just trust me. Trust me. All right, so the sound that's returned from the room should match the direct sound is the place I'm going with all this. Ideally, you want to pick speakers from manufacturers that have worried about the direct sound and the reflected sound equally and actually prove it to you. So now we get into the point of how do you know? If I told you you need to buy a car that goes 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, which would be a fun car, he's going, poof. Well, hopefully the manufacturer discloses that and puts it on their advertising and their brochures and flyers, and you can, hopefully trust them. There it is. But if I tell you you need to buy a speaker that's got a coverage in the room that's even at all frequencies, how do you know you're getting that? They don't tell us. They don't actually disclose that. Now, they do measure it very often. Some people do, some people don't. Well, what's interesting is in the commercial audio world, the world of manufacturers and vendors who equip rooms like this with speakers actually like these, or the ones that are hanging up there, there is actually a disclosure of the axial response and the off-axis response to the sound power response, because in that field people know they have to worry about it, and they're actually given specs for that. In our world, that's not available. But there is ways you can check it yourself. So a really easy thing to do is to get a test disc or a test file with pink noise on it, which sounds like, and you listen in front of the speaker, and you just go like this. Move to the right, move to the left, move up and down, and just hear how it changes. If it changes a lot, it's not very even. And that means that the room reflections won't be a good replica of the direct sound. So let's talk about different types of speakers and what they can look like and sound like. Let's first talk about an idealized speaker that is known in acoustics as the pulsating sphere. It's a concept of a little 1-inch ball that you plug a pair of wires into, and it can take up to 100 volts. And when you energize it positively, it expands. When you put a negative voltage on it, it contracts. And you play music through that. And if it's a very good device, it'll push air and pull air to create sound. And that pulsating sphere would have flat axial response. There is actually no direct access. There's no, you can listen to it everywhere, but from here to you, it would go, if it was a well-designed device. It's a mythical device. It doesn't exist, but it would send correct sound to you, but also off-axis sound, the sound power, is radiated the rest of the directions all equally. So the room is lit up with the same tonal balance as the direct sound. That would be a speaker that has flat sound power. Okay? Now there's a company that does speakers that kind of look like that. Anybody notice them or have seen them? So there's a company called MBL that makes speakers that they kind of look like eggs. And their idea is that the way the whole drive unit works is it compresses and expands this little metal leaf of an egg, and it pushes sound in all directions. It's a speaker that has flat sound power. Okay? Would you want the speaker in your listening room? Maybe yes, maybe no. So really quickly, while this has the ideal character of having sound power and direct sound that are identical, it may also be spraying too much sound into the whole room where you would end up with too much reflected energy, which would mean that a solo guitar has the same sound field size as a full symphonic orchestra, and that may not be right unless you like that kind of thing. But we're talking here about just frequency balance. Now let's look at a real speaker. A real speaker made out of cones and domes would actually have a dispersion that looks like this. At low frequency, they're omnidirectional. They send sound equally in all directions, up, down, left, right, everywhere. In the mid-frequency, they tend to narrow in, where they're more hemispherical. And in the high frequencies, they tend to beam. So a real loudspeaker generally has a low frequency dispersion that's broad in all directions. As you go up in frequency, they beam more and more and more and more. When you're sitting right over here without any walls around you, you don't know what's doing that, because you're just hearing the direct sound from the speaker. But if you sit over there, you're going to hear sound that's missing mids and highs. And if you could somehow listen to the whole room and not just the direct sound of the speaker, which is what you're listening to most of the time, you're listening to a response that's tilted. So let me show you that. So typical speaker made out of cones and domes, whether it's a 2- or 3-way, could have flat axial response if it's well designed, but the radiation of the speaker changes with frequency, and the sound power will be tilted down. So it would look like this, which is that at low frequency, since it's omnidirectional, it's keeping all the energy that you see in the axial. And then as you go up in frequency, it tends to stoop down. That is what that speaker is going to sound like in a room that's untreated, because you're hearing mostly reflected sounds. It's going to tend to sound droopy. And it'll go up and down. Usually this is from the beaming of the woofer, when the tweeter kicks in and around the crossover frequency goes back up, and then it falls back down. So, what do you do? How are you going to get around that? There's ways to get around that. So first of all, what you can do is you can try to get a little bit more directivity out of those speakers, so you're hearing more direct sound and less reflected sound. It's dangerous if you don't do it right, but it's a way to do it. The common ways to do it are either to do stacks of drivers or horns or ribbons. The most obvious thing you see out there is a two-way speaker with a woofer and a horn-loaded tweeter. You've seen those, I'm sure, around. A lot of people do them. Sometimes it's a three-way where there's a woofer, a horn-loaded mid-range, and a horn-loaded tweeter, whatever. The whole point of the horn, the waveguide, is to try to focus more energy towards a listening position and have less reflected energy. Another way to get directivity that's better is to actually do a two- or three-way speaker where you have a stacking of woofers above and below a horn. That works better. Less obvious to most people is the fact that a speaker that looks like this, which is a pair of woofers, a pair of mid-ranges, and a tweeter in the middle, actually has a fair amount of vertical directivity. I don't know if you guys, who actually realized that in the room? Anybody know that? Okay, a few of you guys. So what happens is that the pair of woofers create a doublet of sound energy that focuses sound this way. The pair of mid-ranges does the same thing that focuses sound this way in the mid-range, and the tweeter, by the time it's kicking in, is above a frequency where it really matters too much. So this speaker actually has vertical directivity, which means it's going to be spraying less to the ceiling and floor. Less obvious, too, is that speakers that are made out of stacks of woofers, mid-ranges, and tweeters beam a lot. And they create like a beam of sound that goes from the speaker to the listener, wide horizontal but very beam vertical, to where you're lighting up even less of the ceiling and floor, which can be beneficial. So this is a point where I can actually prove my point. This speaker right here, which is, you know, for the application is a decent speaker, which is by Reinkus Heinz, a company that's actually not far away from here, is made out of a stack of drivers, and it is designed to focus sound towards the audience. It does have an issue here in that the speaker is this high, which is quite a bit over your ear, so it's shooting sound over your head. And I'm going to prove that to you by, I'm going to keep talking, I'm going to tell you a story about sound men, and I'm going to ask all you guys to get up and listen to how the sound changes while I'm telling you the story about how many sound men does it take. You have to get up for this thing. How many sound men does it take to screw in a light bulb? How many sound men? Well, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you guys hear this difference in sound? I'll sit back down while I keep talking. I got to keep talking, otherwise you can't hear the difference. So 1, 2, 3. Can you hear that? Yes. Is it subtle? No. Okay. I've heard that it's actually good for your health to stand more than sit down. Do you know that? That people who have jobs where they stand up are healthier than triathletes? So forget the triathlon. Eat more, drink more wine, and stand. So this is not subtle. This is very obvious, and everything I'm talking about in this presentation is that level of non-subtlety. So there's nothing wrong with a speaker inherently, except that its application is wrong. What really should be done is it should be tilted down towards you, and or just be mounted lower, which I can't do because the pole can't shrink down any lower. So is this sort of like, oh, come on, they should have known better? Do you guys feel like, what? Who are these guys? So there's a lot of this that goes on in the audio business. So like, really? Come on. You should have known better. And this happens. So directivity does matter. Where would you want to use a speaker like this? Let's say you had a listening room that was 18 feet by 14 feet, and you're sitting 10 feet away from the speaker. Would you want something like this that's beaming the sound at you? Probably not. It'd be like a giant set of headphones. It won't really sound very good. If you had a listening room that was 45 feet long by 35 feet wide, and it had glass on one side, marble on the other side, and a wood floor, would you maybe want to use a speaker like this? This may be useful in that it beams the sound towards you and less towards all these reflective surfaces, right? So you do have to match the directivity of the speaker to the use. So what's all this about directivity? you match the directivity to the room, to the intended use, somewhat to your taste to an extent, but largely to the room. So when you're going around looking at all the speakers from the different manufacturers, and some of them are a two-way, woofer tweeter, some of them are a three-way, some of them are this stack of drivers with a tweeter in the middle, that's not just more money for more drivers, that's also changing directivity, and you have to think of that. You have to match that to your room and to your taste. So I'll say this about taste real quickly. Some people like that kind of sound that's very open and wide and spread, and some people don't. And you have to figure out where you are, whether you'd like a more open sound stage or something that's more precise. The more directivity you're going to have, the more clarity and articulation and tighter imaging you're going to have, the more dispersion, or the more it spreads the sound in the room, the smoother the overall sound field is going to feel, and the more enveloping it's going to feel. However, you won't have good contrast between a solo guitar and an orchestral piece. And you have to choose which one you like, understanding where you're going with it. All right. So I'll say this really quickly. I have found that by and large, over the years, speakers have changed in directivity from all kinds of designs. If you went back 40 years, the two core camps were the Bose 901 type, if you guys remember those, that sprayed sound everywhere in the room, and the Klipschorn, which was these directional speakers. And those are two opposing views. And what I found over time is our industry has actually focused in on a middle between those two, which is a reasonable compromise of the typical two- or three-way speaker in a box that's hemispherical radiating, that's the right balance between directivity and envelopment. So evolution has led us to a speaker that's a good midway point. And I do find that if you want to go from strictly two-channel music into multi-channel applications, whether it's music or film, it may be worth getting a little bit more directivity. And that's in order to reduce what I call the cacophony syndrome. When you have multiple speakers around you spraying a lot of sound around into the reverberant field, you get to a point where your brain can get overwhelmed because there's so much reflected energy, you're like, man, I can't tell anymore. And it is sometimes beneficial to focus the sound a little bit more when you're switching to multi-channel coming out of two-channel. Not always necessary, but sometimes beneficial. Quick side note, how many of you have home cinemas, home theaters? Okay. Do you have a center speaker that looks like something like this? Two woofers and a tweeter in the middle. Beware, those speakers tend to radiate in the room with lobing in the mid-frequency, around 2 kilohertz. The sound here is different to the sound there, different to the sound there, different to the sound there, because of the interaction between the two woofers. And where the speaker's role is to play back the middle sound of the screen, which has a lot of dialogue, it actually fails for the person sitting to your right or to your left. And this can really screw up the sound quality. So if you ever have a condition where, you're the captain, you're sitting in the middle, and the person to your left is going, I don't understand what they're saying. What? What they say? And then you can't stay in the movie because the person's always like, poking you in the ribs going, what they say? My first recommendation would be quit the movie, go eat some food and drink some wine. Second one was maybe you're dealing with this, which is a true syndrome. The person sitting next to you is not deaf or annoying. There could be a real problem. And how can you tell? Well, if you grab pink noise test signals, by the way, I have a calibration test disc over here I produced about 10 years ago. I'm about to launch a new version of this. This has a whole bunch of different test signals in it, including pink noise, that you can play out of the center speaker and just move your head like this, and you go, whoa, listen to this. It's like shh, whoosh. Per person who's sitting to your right or to your left is hearing a recessed mid-frequency. It doesn't sound good. So, now all speakers, because they're stacks of drivers, are going to have some lobing to an extent, any combination of woofer and tweeter, and you need to make sure the speaker is aimed correctly so you're hearing all the sound. So you aim them using pink noise. There's a lot of speakers that are known sometimes as Diapolito drivers, which is a woofer on the top, woofer on the bottom, a tweeter in the middle, which looks like a center speaker placed vertically like the way it's supposed to. All the same lobing problems I mentioned horizontally before are now vertical. You want to make sure this thing is aimed at you, and how you do that is you can either listen to music that changes all the time, or you can just put up some pink noise and just, you know, sit down there, stand up, sit down, crouch down like this, make sure nobody's watching you because they're going to think you're a little crazy, but that's how you can tell with pink noise, okay? So, has anything I've said so far cost you any money? You may have to go spend 20 bucks to get a test disc, okay, or download a test generator for your phone for 4 bucks. Most of the stuff is free. Aiming, all these other things. So I'm going to talk about more free things here. Speakers can have other sources of errors, which are distortions, buzzes, harmonics, diffractions, and that's just about building a good speaker. And I don't really have time to go into those, just realize that some speakers have distortions. All right. Now, let's talk about placement of the speakers. You guys all know that the placement of a speaker is pretty critical to sound. Do you know how or why or where and how? Let's talk about that really quickly. So, the reflection issues near the speakers are often called boundary effects, and those effects can cause peaks and dips in the frequency response, which means places where the sound is louder, places where it's quieter. And they depend on the speaker location. They're most challenging at low frequency, and if you try to absorb the reflected sound, you would find, wow, that's really hard to do because you need really thick absorbers. So the worst issue is the one that's the hardest one to fix with just acoustical control. So let's look at this. If the green curve, the one I keep showing, is the ideal reference response, this is what will happen to a speaker when you place it in a room, either very close to a corner or even a few feet away from the corner. The reflections around the speaker will cause variations. This is a chart that shows the change of variations as you move the speaker in or out of the corner. It can get worse, it can get better, but in all cases it ain't very good, and you got to worry about it. So what do you do with that? The goal is to have a smooth frequency response in the room, and the strategies are first, maybe try moving the speaker around until the peaks and dips are reduced. How do you know that you've reduced the peaks and dips? Best way to do it is to actually measure it with an electronic measurement system. I'll talk about that in a second, but I find a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to do this by listening to music, and the challenge with that is that by the time you think you've gotten to the better sound, the music has changed, so you don't know if you've gotten somewhere. So it's a lot better to use test signals that are made for this and test instruments that are made for this, all of which used to cost $25,000 20 years ago, and all of which are just about free today. You can download analyzer programs for a computer. You can go buy a test microphone for 50 bucks. It works fine. And if you're not spending that money, you're wasting time. Precious time you could be using to listen to music and drink wine. So, some strategies to reduce low-frequency errors are to use what's called Helmholtz or diaphragm methods for absorption. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And also equalize. If you do proper placement, proper treatments, and proper equalization, you'll end up cleaning up your bass to the point where it sounds more convincing, more real, and more accurate. So, in placing the speakers, what my intention right now is to explain to you what is happening as you move the speaker around. There is a condition over here where the speaker has direct sound to the listening position and has a reflection off the wall. That reflection arrives at you a little bit later, and at some frequencies, that reflection is going to cause a cancellation compared to the direct sound because it's pulling instead of pushing. There's another reflection over here that arrives later. The worst case condition is when you have all of those reflection paths be equal to each other so that they're all pulling from the direct sound equally. That's the worst. You guys follow that? So direct sound is trying to give you the right sound, and all the reflected paths are working together against the direct sound. That's a condition that would look like this, where they're dipping together. What you want to do is to separate them out. So you want to move the speaker speakers to a point where the reflection off the right wall is a different path length to the reflection off the floor, and different from the reflection off the front wall and to the back wall and the ceiling. And without understanding that necessarily, that's what you're doing when you're moving the speaker around, is you're changing the interactions between the direct sound and the reflection. So this is what we're aiming for is a spread of the reflected dips. Now, after you're done moving the speakers to where the dips are the least bad possible, they still are peaks and dips. They're just less bad. And at that point, you want to invoke the use of a good equalizer. And I know that's heresy in this business. Well, guess what? All the recording engineers whose program material you're listening to are listening to speakers that were carefully placed in a room and then were equalized. Good enough for them? Who do this for a living and who craft that fine dish, that fine musical dish, should be good enough for you, as long as you use a good quality equalizer. Whether it's analog, digital, manually, whatever it is, you want to have a good quality one and you want to tune it carefully. So, there are people who worry about the phase errors introduced by equalizers. Anybody ever heard that? And yes, there is a phase error, but guess what? If there is a peak in the room, acoustically, that peak also has a phase error. You can't have, it's physically impossible to have a peak condition in a room without also having a phase error acoustically. So when the equalizer is invoked to pull that peak down, it's going to introduce a phase error that's equal and opposite, which is good. So, now, here's the real trick about equalization, I'm going to bypass this, is you need a measurement device that allows you how to use the tool. And a measurement device would be a good system that has multiple microphones or microphone locations and a good, what's called FFT, Fast Fourier Transform Analyzer. And you can get one for essentially free from REW. If you just go to the website called rew.com or hometheatershack.com, you can download this and you can buy these microphones for $50 each. You owe it to yourself to start playing with this. Now, you want to listen to their tutorial, you want to spend some time learning it, or hire the services of a good audio engineer to come and help you tune the thing. It'll save you a bunch of time. Okay, we're getting really low on time, but I got to talk about this. So, John, give me a second, and then we'll take your questions. So, rooms are the biggest source of trouble. They're a mess. One of the biggest mess they introduce is called standing waves. And standing waves is when the wavelength, when the size of the wave in the room is the same dimension as the room, or twice as long as the room, or 1.5 times the room. There's going to be a resonance in the room. There's going to be a condition where the sound is louder at certain places in the room, or where the sound hangs in the room for up to 2 seconds. All of that is bad. And I'm going to bypass these beautiful drawings because I actually love to show this data. So, a really bad condition is one where you have a room in which there's a resonance in the room that creates loud sound over here, quiet sound here, loud, quiet, and loud. Where your couch is, you're missing some frequencies. But you could actually have a room in which the proportions lead to a width resonance where there's quiet sound along the middle point. Now, when you're at the main seating position, you have a cancellation from the width direction and from the length direction, which means that some frequency, most typically 50 or 60 hertz, is pulled way down. How audible is this? How measurable is this? Take a look at this. So, I'm bypassing this, So this is a true measurement I did very recently and presented as a paper to the Audio Engineering Society in LA last month. So this is a good subwoofer made by Triad, measured outdoors with a good test microphone in the near field. So the microphone's put right in the cone. It's a very, very well executed subwoofer. And this is the response of the subwoofer from 10 hertz through to 500 hertz. Right as of 20 hertz, which is the lowest frequency you typically want to hear, all the way up, it's very, very even. The variations here are about 1 decibel. A good subwoofer. I take that subwoofer and I put it in a room at a location that would correspond to a left speaker. And this is what you get. This is a true picture of what truly happened. Here's the subwoofer, here's the microphone, here you see it. Here's the response of that same subwoofer. So, remember originally we had a curve that went up here, is nice and smooth. Well, there's a little peak over here at 35 hertz. There's a giant cancellation at 52 hertz. The difference between these two is 38 decibels. So, a tube amplifier to speaker interaction is 3 dB. The speaker itself, whether it's a full-range speaker or a subwoofer, has a 38 decibel error. Do we want to worry about this? Let's worry about this. Now, what is this going to do? This is going to actually do two things. One that's obvious, one that's less obvious. The one that's obvious is, you ain't hearing no 52 hertz. The other one that's less obvious is the way you're not hearing it is there's a resonance that's creating a cancellation at that range, and that resonance is very high Q, it's called, which means that at other seats in the room, the 52 hertz is hanging out for 2 seconds. So if there's a kick drum at 52 hertz, which is, sort of typical jazz kick drum, it's going to sound like boom. It won't be tight. So this is bad. We got to fix this. We can't allow this, and we have to do a few strategies to get rid of this. So 5-point strategy is what it takes. First, if you can actually change the room dimensions, if you're building from scratch, build a room to where the resonances are not all the same frequencies along the length, width, and height. Second strategy is don't put the subwoofer where it's going to exacerbate standing waves, and there's a way to know that. Third strategy is to use some kind of bass absorber to get rid of the energy at the resonance frequency. Another strategy is don't sit where you hear peaks and dips. So that problem at 52 hertz, if I move that microphone around a little bit, you'll find it at a different frequency. But what you want to try to do is to not sit at a place where the standing waves have the worst errors. And finally, after you've done as much of this as possible, with what's left, you equalize. All of these things here, the moving the speaker, using bass absorption, and moving the seat location, can be done by using a simple tool. Again, an analyzer, this thing called REW that you can download for free, with a simple little test microphone for $50. And you've got a tool where you can actually see everything I just measured. Okay, that data I showed you was done with REW, free program. Now, bass absorption is a tricky thing, and over the years of frustration around how hard it can be, we ended up designing and patenting our own version called a spring trap, which is an interesting triangular contraption that's internally pressurized with springs, and it's a multi-ported device. It's very, very tricky. Read the patent. If you have any amount of insomnia, it'll pretty much cure that. But it's a box that costs about $1,000 that will absorb standing wave problems up to about 25 dB. So those errors of 38 dB, we're going to get rid of 25 of that, which is a great start. This box, typically you put one in the corner, one or two in the corners of the room, and you'll tighten up the bass issues. All right. I'm going to talk about room reflections really quickly, and then I'm going to take questions and answers. And we normally want to get out of here. We normally want to get out of here in 6 minutes. I'll talk as much as I can in here, and then if some of you guys want to stay, I'll take it outside. Okay? We'll go by the pool and talk about acoustics. So, no. So, understand that reflections are desirable, but the wrong reflections can lead to distortion. Okay? So, beware of the wrong reflections. Some of the solutions to these reflections are absorptive materials. So, panels made out of some kind of fibrous material that's going to convert the acoustic energy into heat through friction, or by controlling and redirecting the reflections through scattering, where you break up the vector of sound into small pieces that gives you a smoother sense of ambience. Let's bypass all this. Let's bypass all this. Let's go here. Should we eliminate all reflections? If reflections are a problem, should we just get rid of them? No. You're in a room, you want to hear some reflections. If you eliminate all of them, your brain goes, what? It's like sensory deprivation. You're like, something is wrong. Now, recording engineers often live in spaces that are very, very absorbed, and they get used to listening to that. It's not the right way to listen to music. You want some amount of reflection. So, how much? Let's go over here. Generally speaking, I like to set up rooms where there's a good balance between scattering or diffusion, same kind of synonyms, and absorption. I like to put what's called 2D diffusion towards the front of a room. 2D diffusion is typically like a cylindrical shape where the sound that hits it would scatter out horizontally only. And I like to put 3D diffusion towards the back of the room. That's a device where when the sound hits it, it scatters out hemispherically. This would be a 2D diffuser. This is also a 2D diffuser that scatters the sound out in a plane. These would be, this is one of the ones we make. This would be a 3D diffuser that scatters the sound in a hemisphere. Okay, so let me show you a few general guidelines and rules and recipes. After 25 years of trial and error, I've come to the conclusion, and have also read a lot of research papers that say that somewhere around 20% of absorptive coverage in a room is a good target. So if you look at this wall, you look at the total surface of it, you want to cover no more than 20% of that with absorptive materials. If you cover more than that, the room's going to be too dead. You also want to cover with about 20% of diffusive or scattering materials. Don't forget the ceiling, don't forget the base. Okay, so almost at the end here. This is a kind of idealized layout for what to do in a room with absorbers and diffusers. So this is a view from the top. This is a reflected ceiling plan. This, on the ceiling, we would put some absorbers between the speakers and the listener that catch that first reflection off the ceiling, and some diffusers towards the area behind the listener, so that what passes your head and bounces around there is returned back in the room, scattered, billowing sound energy randomly from the back of the room. This is the left wall, that's the right wall. I'll show you this in elevation view. So this is you sitting, listening to your speakers, and these are absorbers. Just 3 panels. It could be like 2 foot by 4 foot panels, not more than that. If you actually took those panels, stuck them into the bottom left corner of the room, or bottom right left corner of the room, you can see that it's not even 25% of the room, right? So some absorbers and some diffusers. These would be 2D diffusers. These would be 3D diffusers. This would be the left wall. Right wall would look like this. Some absorbers, some diffusers. Interleaved, 2D diffusers towards the front, 3D diffusers towards the back. On the right wall, if you took all the absorbers and stuck them on the floor, you'll see it's not a lot of coverage of the room. On the back wall, we'd put absorbers in the middle and diffusers towards the outside, so the sound from the speakers that passes you is absorbed in the middle of the room and is scattered towards the back edges, where it creates a sense of envelopment and scattering. Now, let's look at what this all does in a schematic of the sound field of the room. Direct sound reaches your head. Reflected sound, some of it's absorbed, some of it's scattered. Some of it's absorbed, some of it's scattered. Absorbed, scattered. Scattered, there we go. Scattered, absorbed. From the ceiling, the sound is reflecting, but it's scattering around. And from the other side, we get this. So remember the diagram I showed in the beginning of this, where we had a lot of strong red arrows coming back at you, creating a very strong reflected pattern from random incidences? Here we still have reflections, but they're controlled in a way. 20% of the energy that's reflected is absorbed out, so you have a little more direct sound in the ratio, and the rest of it is controlled to create a smooth crescent of sound all the way around you, which sounds very pleasant and sounds like a concert hall. So that's the direction we're trying to go to. We're trying to get speakers with the right directivity that have the same sound on axis as off axis. 20% of the off-axis sound, we want to tame it down. Another 20% of it, we want to scatter it so that it supports the energy laterally and up and down. And if you do all this, you're going to end up with a very smooth reflected trail and decay in which the interface between the speaker, the room, and the listener are now controlled. So paying attention to the directivity of the speakers and paying attention to the room acoustics is very high value in tuning the room, and you should be worrying about it, putting a little bit of time and money into it, and it's well worth it, okay? So, we're largely out of time. Roger, are you the next guy here, or you are? Can I steal how much time do you need for setup? I'm fine, he says. Roger Scoff, by the way. Say hello to Roger. Hi, Roger. So I'm going to steal 5 minutes from Roger. I'll give it back to you some other time with interest. So let me say these 2 or 3 more things, and I'll take questions. So, over the years of doing this stuff, I've actually ended up producing some acoustical tuning packages, and they're called Dimension 4. There's 4 choices: Symphony, Concerto, Sonata, and Harmony. This is the cheap and cheerful, simple solution for around $2,000, and they go up in price, up to about $12,000 for the higher end solution. And I'm going to click through slides very quickly. All systems include absorbers, diffusers, and bass traps to do all of the things I talked about doing. And all of the systems are available for small rooms, medium rooms, large rooms. So the systems that are called 250 are typically targeted for rooms that are 250 square feet. So if you were interested in a Sonata system and your room was 350 square feet, you're looking for a Sonata 350. Pretty simple math, right? So, I'm going to go through this and just show you this. This would be a layout of a Sonata system in a 350 square foot room that shows the seating location, in this case a 5-channel sound system, 3 fronts, 2 sides, and a layout of absorbers here and absorbers there, seen from the back, and a layout of diffusers here, 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 here. Pretty much similar to that diagram I showed you before, right? And if you put this in the room, you will tame down 20% of your reflections, scatter a fair amount of them, and you'll end up with a really beautiful sound field that sounds more symphonic, more like you're really in a concert hall. Blah, 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 there you go. So a small room with Sonata would look like this. A big room with a Sonata 650 just has more absorbers, more diffusers, all of that. Now, this is what a room would look like with Sonata. It looks kind of like a sound studio, but if you actually were to implement a stretch fabric dress, which is what we do 90% of the time with this, where you actually build sort of a fake wall that has stretch fabric on it, as long as the fabric is acoustically transparent, you cover it up, you don't see it. You could also hide some speakers behind that, hide the wires, and you end up with a room that's got a very smooth look. All right, so we have other systems like Concerto, which the panels are tapered and look good on the wall. This would be a gray room with gray panels, blue room with blue panels, red room with red panels, red and green in a room. And at the highest end, we have a system called Symphony, in which the absorbers and diffusers are all much thicker, much higher performance, made out of solid wood. They're gorgeous, and they work beautifully, and there you go, and I'm out of here, and I'll take a few questions and take you. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. I have one more element of plain propaganda I want to tell you. Sorry. Let me go over here. So, my conclusions is tuning takes a lot of care. You have to have the right speakers, the right placement, the right acoustics, the right EQ, the right program material. I'll take questions in a second, but let me show you this. This just in. We'll be actually introducing this to the market this fall. This is a brand new speaker package that I've co-developed with our chief engineer, Manny Lacaruba, and it's this big bad boy called the Alpha. That's a speaker that is very audiophile, has very wide sound power, so the way it sprays into the room is very, very smooth, and happens to also play loud enough to be able to light up a 1,000 square foot room with really loud sound. I'm short. It's a pretty big speaker. This is our general manager, Rick. He's 6'5". That's what the speaker looks like relative to him. So if any of you have need for a big speaker for a big room, we should talk. All right, let's take some questions. Yep.
Okay. I have an L-shaped room.
Okay.
It's 11 feet wide by 33 feet long, and then there's this kitchen table,
right,
and it has its own space. So I'm wondering, would it be beneficial for me to hang drapes to cut off that kitchen area?
Yeah.
Or would it be beneficial for me to hang drapes, say 2/3 of the distance back in the living room area?
Yeah. So 33 by 11.
Yeah.
So the long part of the L is 33 feet. That's a very long length for the width of the room. So if you could sit through my 2-day-long acoustics session, we would talk about proportions. Usually with 11 wide, I wouldn't want to go much longer than 20 for lots of reasons. So if you can hang a drape somewhere around 20 feet, but if that drape is fully absorptive, you may deaden out the room. We make a drape that's branded Eclipse. It's actually internally made out of strips of reflective material and absorptive material that give you diffusion and absorption. It looks just like a drape like this. It's just internally layered with these different materials. You put that somewhere around 20 feet, and you've contained your acoustic energy from about 500 hertz up to a shorter space that'll improve your sound.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question.
Anthony, unfortunately, Roger does need to access the room now.
Okay.
And perhaps they can meet with you
Yep.
out in the hall. If you have questions,
if any of you have questions, just meet me right outside. I'm going to, I have flyers and brochures and business cards over here. If any of you guys need a PDF of the presentation, grab the card over here, shoot me an email, grab any of the flyers and brochures over here while I'm packing up, and we'll see you guys right outside if you have any questions. Thank you very, very much.